welcome to the deep dive. If you're joining us for the first time, or if you're a longtime listener, do me a quick favor right up front.
Hit that like button.
Exactly. Yeah, hit the like button and make sure you subscribe to the show. It genuinely helps us continue bringing you these massive, exhaustive breakdowns.
And trust me, you really are not going to want to miss a single second of what we're tackling today.
No, you are not. Today's deep dive is an exclusive, highly detailed review of a completely groundbreaking ebook. We are looking at what is essentially the ultimate manual for understanding the architecture of the human mind.
It's massive.
It is. And if you find yourself hooked by what we uncover today, you need to go buy this book immediately. It's called Piaget Stages, a simplified guide to understanding human development.
By Conrad Riker.
Right, by Conrad Riker. You can search for it right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. Buy it, read it, and be sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack for a steady stream of incredible insights.
It's just a profoundly dense and fascinating piece of source material. We have a huge stack of notes, excerpts, historical context, and research pulled directly from this ebook.
Yeah, our mission today is to decode it all. We're going fundamentally into the very framework of human thought, looking at the exact mechanics of how a human being constructs reality from the ground up.
And we should note Riker's very specific about who this book is written for.
He is. For you listening especially, the rational red-pilled man who is actively seeking to understand the objective reality of how humans develop, how we process information, and how we interact with a chaotic world, this deep dive is going to be your shortcut.
The text posits itself as a guide to mastering the psychological frameworks that dictate human behavior, our morality, and our logic.
Which the source argues is vital for understanding the history of our institutions before they were captured by feminists and Marxists.
Right, we're just impartially reporting the author's assertions here, but he clearly states this knowledge is crucial for a men's rights activist audience, or really any manosphere, men trying to grasp objective reality.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start by setting the historical stage. Who was Jean Piaget, and why does Riker's book argue that his work was essentially a nuclear explosion in the field of psychology?
Well, to really grasp the magnitude of Piaget's impact, you have to look at the landscape of psychology in the early to mid-20th century.
Right.
At that time, the undisputed heavyweight champion of the psychological world was behaviorism.
B.F. Skinner.
Skinner, exactly, and John B. Watson. The behaviorist perspective essentially treated the human mind, and especially the minds of children, as a black box.
Or like a passive sponge.
Yeah, passive sponge is
Right.
a good way to put it. The prevailing belief was that human behavior and cognition were nothing more than conditioned responses to environmental stimuli.
It's a very mechanical view of humanity.
Yeah.
You know, you introduce a stimulus, you get a response,
Yeah.
you reward or punish that response, and that's entirely how learning happens.
It was almost like they were treating humans as complex vending machines.
Right, you put the coin in, you press the button, the behavior comes out.
That is a highly accurate way to frame how they viewed it. They wanted psychology to be a hard science, like physics. They only wanted to measure what they could observe externally.
And Riker uses a really brilliant analogy in the book to describe this era.
The ocean analogy.
Yeah. He asks you to imagine the academic world of psychology as a vast, calm ocean. The behaviorist ship was this massive, impenetrable dreadnought steaming full speed ahead, completely confident in its course.
Because their theories were based on observable, strictly controlled, repeatable laboratory experiments.
They had the rats in the mazes.
They had the pigeons pecking the levers. They felt they had solved the puzzle of learning.
And then Piaget comes along. Riker frames Piaget as a nuclear submarine suddenly emerging from the depths and completely shattering that calm, confident surface.
He absolutely disrupted everything. Piaget dared to look inside the black box.
He proclaimed that children are not just miniature defective adults.
Right, they aren't just passive recipients of knowledge waiting to be filled up with facts by their parents and teachers.
Instead, he proposed that they are developing individuals with entirely unique alien cognitive structures that change fundamentally at different stages of life.
Piaget proved that we actively construct our knowledge. We aren't absorbing reality. We are building our understanding of the world through constant active friction with it.
The book uses another analogy to explain this shift, and I think it's the perfect way to anchor our whole conversation today. It compares human cognitive development to computing.
Before Piaget, the assumption was that learning was just about adding more files to a hard drive.
You send a kid to school, you cram more data into the storage bank, and they get smarter.
But Piaget showed that human development is actually a complete, total upgrade of the processing software itself.
And here's the kicker. that software isn't pre-installed at birth. The human brain has to build, test, and modify its own operating system through physical experience.
And that operating system goes through 4 major version updates.
That is the core of Piaget's theory and the central focus of our source material today.
You have the sensorimotor stage, the preoperational stage, the concrete operational stage, and finally the formal operational stage.
Each of these represents a fundamental, irreversible shift in how the brain processes information and reality itself.
Which pulls us right into part 1 of our deep dive, the sensorimotor stage.
This covers the timeline from birth to roughly 2 years old. The mission here is literally building the foundation of reality.
Now, Riker describes the infant in this stage as a literal scientist.
And I have to push back on this a little bit, or at least ask for some clarification. When I look at a 2-month-old baby, I see a creature that's basically just a chaotic bundle of reflexes.
They're just flailing around.
Yeah, are we giving babies too much credit by calling them scientists, or is there actual methodology to that flailing?
Well, it looks like flailing to us because we've already mastered the physics engine of reality, but you have to strip away everything you know.
Okay.
Imagine being booted into an alien simulation with absolutely no prior data, no language, no context, and no understanding of physics, gravity, or light.
Just totally blind.
Your surroundings are just a chaotic, terrifying whirlwind of raw sensory stimulation. The infant has to interact with this physical world purely through touch, sight, sound, and movement to figure out the basic rules of cause and effect.
So when Riker calls them a scientist, he means it in the purest, most elemental sense.
They are running a continuous loop of hypothesis, experiment, observation, and conclusion.
Give me an example, because when a baby continuously drops a spoon off a high chair, and the parent picks it up and the baby drops it again, it just feels like they're being a tiny tyrant.
From the parent's perspective, it's exhausting. But from the baby's perspective, it's a rigorous physics experiment.
They're testing a hypothesis.
Exactly, about gravity and object permanence. Does it fall every time? Does it fall at the same speed?
If I drop it on the carpet, does it make the same sound as when I drop it on the tile?
What happens to the large creature, the parent, when I drop it? They're systematically gathering data about the physical properties of their environment.
The text breaks this 2-year sensorimotor stage down into 6 highly specific substages, and the level of detail Riker goes into is wild. It really highlights how rapid this initial software compilation is.
Let's walk through them. The first substage is just from birth to 1 month old. This is the realm of pure reflexes.
During this first month, the behavior is almost entirely hardwired. They suck, they grasp your finger, they startle at loud noises.
These aren't conscious, planned, strategic actions. They're automatic, instinctive responses.
However, Piaget's genius was recognizing that these basic reflexes are the foundational building blocks for all future cognitive skills.
That grasping reflex isn't just a party trick. It is the baby's very first mechanism for pulling data from the physical environment into the brain.
Then we hit the second substage, which is months 1 through 4. Riker calls this the formation of the first habits.
The example he uses is thumb sucking.
Right, it starts as a completely random, accidental movement. The baby arm flails, the thumb happens to land in the mouth, and the baby realizes, oh, this sensory input is soothing.
And then they actively try to run that specific physical loop again.
What's fascinating here is that the baby's entire universe is still restricted to their own physical body.
They aren't trying to manipulate the outside world yet. They're just trying to map out their own physical boundaries.
But that changes dramatically in the third substage, which spans from 4 to 8 months.
The focus suddenly shifts outward. Piaget termed this the phase of secondary circular reactions.
That's a very academic term. Let's translate that. What does a secondary circular reaction actually look like in a living room?
It's the moment the baby realizes they have agency in the universe. They learn that an action they perform has a direct observable effect on an external object.
For instance, they're lying in a crib, they kick their leg, and they accidentally hit a dangling toy on their mobile.
The toy spins and plays a sound. The baby enjoys that sensory result, so they intentionally repeat the action. They kick again.
They're no longer just exploring their own body. They're intentionally manipulating their environment to recreate an interesting event.
They're hacking the matrix for the first time.
And that rolls right into the fourth substage, from 8 to 12 months. Riker highlights this as a massive milestone because it's the absolute dawn of goal-oriented behavior.
Cause and effect lock in. They aren't just repeating accidents anymore, they are strategizing.
The book uses the example of a baby who sees a toy they want, but there is a pillow in the way.
They will actively push the pillow aside, which is an action they don't care about. specifically to achieve the goal of grabbing the toy.
That requires holding a sequence of events in their working memory. It's a massive leap in executive function.
Which brings us to the fifth substage, 12 to 18 months. This is characterized by active, relentless exploration and discovery through trial and error.
Because infants are usually becoming highly mobile at this age, crawling, pulling themselves up, maybe walking, they can explore much more freely.
This is the era every parent dreads. The toddler in the kitchen cabinets.
They're pulling out the pots, the pans, the Tupperware.
Exactly, and they're intensely curious. They will try dropping a metal pot, then a plastic bowl, then a wooden spoon, just to see what happens.
They're actively varying their behaviors to observe different outcomes. They're pushing the limits of the physics engine.
And finally, the sixth substage, which closes out this era from 18 to 24 months. This is the grand transition.
Riker calls it the dawn of symbolic thought. It is the very first spark of internal creativity.
They don't have to rely exclusively on physical trial and error anymore. If a toy rolls under the couch, they don't just blindly reach for it until they get frustrated.
They can actually pause, visualize the toy under the couch, and figure out a solution in their mind before acting.
They're forming mental representations. They can hold an image of an object in their mind even when it isn't physically present.
And this is the absolute prerequisite for language.
Yeah.
Because what is a word? A word is just an auditory symbol that represents a physical object or concept.
You cannot understand the word dog unless you can hold the mental concept of a dog in your head when the animal isn't in the room.
Now, zooming out on this entire 2-year sensorimotor stage, Riker argues there is one overarching cognitive achievement that dwarfs all the others.
Object permanence.
Right. We all know the game Peekaboo. But the book breaks down the sheer existential terror and philosophy behind why that game works on a baby and why it stops working.
To understand object permanence, you have to understand the solipsism of a newborn.
For a newborn, reality only exists as long as they are directly perceiving it.
If an object is out of their line of sight, it does not exist. It hasn't moved. It has been annihilated from the universe.
If you show a 4-month-old some shiny keys and then put those keys under a blanket while they're watching you, the baby will not look for the keys.
But they won't try to lift the blanket because in their mind, the keys are gone.
Which is why Peekaboo is basically magic to a 6-month-old.
Right.
You cover your face, you cease to exist, you pull your hands away, you're manifested back into reality out of thin air. It's thrilling.
But as they progress through these substages, they develop object permanence. They learn the fundamental rule that objects and people continue to exist independently of their own perception of them.
They understand the keys are still under the blanket.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Riker connects object permanence to a human's foundational understanding of time and space.
He argues that when a mother walks out of a room and the baby holds the mental representation that she still exists somewhere else and then she returns, that sequence creates the very first concept of before and after.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, object permanence is the bedrock of temporal reality. Before this, the infant lives in a pure, continuous present.
There's no past to regret and no future to anticipate.
But the realization that mom exists when she isn't visible and that she can leave and return forces the brain to grasp sequences.
They understand that an action occurred in the past, and they can anticipate that an event will occur in the future.
The cognition of past, present, and future is born from the simple realization that things exist when you aren't looking at them.
And space, too. Because before this space is only the distance their hands can reach. But if mom is in another room, space becomes infinite. There's an out there.
And to back all of this behavioral observation up, Riker dives into the actual neuroscience. What is physically happening in the brain to allow this operating system to compile so quickly?
It's an explosion of neural connectivity that we will never experience again in our lives. At birth, an infant's brain has roughly 10 million synaptic connections.
But during these first 2 years, driven by this intense sensorimotor exploration, that number explodes to over 1 quadrillion synapses.
Let's just pause on that number. 1 quadrillion. It's an abstract number. How do we even visualize that?
Think of it like building the infrastructure of the global internet. When a baby is born, they have a few main servers connected by a couple of dial-up lines.
But every time that baby drops a toy, touches a rough texture, tastes a lemon, or tracks a moving object with their eyes, they're laying down massive bundles of fiber optic cables.
This process is called synaptogenesis. The brain is wildly overproducing connections, wiring up every possible pathway to ensure it can process the flood of data coming in.
Riker cites some incredible research here by a neuroscientist named Dr. David E. Olds. He studied the effects of early interventions on cognitive development, specifically focusing on this 2-year window.
Old's research is a perfect validation of Piaget's theories. He looked at children who received highly intensive, enriching interventions during their first 2 years.
Environments that provided safe, complex, diverse physical and sensory stimuli.
His longitudinal data proved that maximizing this window of extreme brain plasticity resulted in significantly higher IQs, better executive function, and superior academic performance decades later.
Because those kids were given a richer laboratory, they had more materials for their scientific experiments.
If you leave a baby in a barren room with no stimulation, you are starving the brain of the physical data it needs to build those fiber optic cables.
Precisely. You're artificially capping the potential of their operating system before they even learn to speak.
Okay, so the brain has mapped the physical world. The foundation is poured.
That transitions us into part 2 of our deep dive, the preoperational stage. This covers roughly the ages of 2 to 7.
The software has had its first major upgrade. We're out of the purely physical realm and entering the dawn of symbols.
But Riker also calls this era the trap of egocentrism.
The most obvious marker that a child has entered the preoperational stage is the absolute explosion of language.
During the sensorimotor stage, communication was physical crying, pointing. Now they discover the power of the word.
Riker describes children at this age as suddenly turning into little parrots. They will repeat anything and everything they hear often, to the intense embarrassment of their parents in public.
But it's not just babbling. It is the profound realization that an invisible auditory sound can stand in for a physical object.
This is the symbolic function. It is a monumental cognitive leap. The child's mind is no longer chained to the immediate physical present.
Because they understand symbols, they can discuss a trip to the park that happened yesterday or anticipate eating a cookie tomorrow.
And this symbolic function is the genesis of imagination and pretend play.
The book has some great relatable examples of this, because a child understands that one thing can represent another. They can pick up a banana, hold it to their ear, and have a full conversation pretending it's a telephone.
They can climb into an empty Amazon cardboard box and genuinely experience it as a spaceship or a race car.
To an adult, it looks like cute, frivolous play. To a developmental psychologist, it is vital cognitive exercise.
They're actively practicing manipulating mental representations. They're testing the boundaries of reality and fantasy.
However, as Riker details extensively this, preoperational stage is also defined by severe, almost comical cognitive limitations.
And the most famous of these is what Piaget termed egocentrism.
We need to define this carefully because when adults use the word egocentric, we mean someone is a narcissist. We mean they're arrogant or selfish.
But Riker is very clear that Piaget is using this term in a strictly mechanical cognitive sense.
That distinction is crucial. In Piagetian terms, egocentrism is a hardware limitation, not a moral failing.
The child literally lacks the neural architecture required to comprehend that other people possess different perspectives, different thoughts, or access to different information than they do.
In their mind, the universe is a single-player game and they're the only camera angle.
They assume that whatever they see, hear, and feel is exactly what everyone else in the world is experiencing simultaneously.
The classic example Riker brings up is a toddler playing hide and seek. A 3-year-old will, quote unquote, hide by simply standing in the middle of the living room, facing the wall, and covering their own eyes.
To an adult, it's hilarious. But walk us through the logic of why the child thinks this is a foolproof strategy.
Well, the child's logic is flawlessly consistent within their limited operating system. Their premise is, I cannot see the seeker.
Because they're egocentric, they project their own perspective onto the seeker. Therefore, they conclude, if my vision is blocked, the seeker's vision must also be blocked. If I cannot see you, you cannot see me.
Or the example of the child talking to their grandmother on the phone. The grandmother asks, did you have fun at the park today? And the child just silently nods their head.
They completely fail to realize that the grandmother who is miles away cannot see them over the phone.
They just assume their grandmother shares their exact visual field. Honestly, reading this section, I couldn't help but think about how many adults still seem stuck in this trap.
You sit in a corporate meeting, and one department is completely incapable of understanding why another department has different priorities. The egocentrism doesn't always fully disappear.
It's a very fair observation, and we'll actually touch on that adult application later. But in the preoperational child, this inability to decenter from their own perspective leads to other massive limitations.
Primarily, their failure to understand a concept called conservation.
This is the most famous Piaget experiment. Riker details it step by step. Let's break down the conservation of liquid task.
Imagine you have a 5-year-old sitting at a table. You place 2 identical short, wide glasses in front of them, and you fill them with the exact same amount of water.
You ask the child, do these glasses have the same amount of water? Or does one have more?
The child compares them, and correctly says they are the same.
Okay, step 1 is successful. They understand equality.
But then right in front of the child's eyes, you take one of those short, wide glasses and pour the water into a tall, very thin glass.
Now you have one short, wide glass and one tall, thin glass.
You ask the child again which glass has more water, or are they the same? Almost every single time a child in the preoperational stage will point to the tall, thin glass and say it has more water.
Even though they just watched you pour it. Why? How can their logic be that flawed?
Because they're completely mesmerized by the immediate visual dominance of the water level being higher. They can only focus on one single dimension at a time, in this case, height.
They completely ignore the width of the glass.
Furthermore, they lack the cognitive ability called reversibility. They cannot mentally play the tape backward in their head and imagine pouring the water back into the short glass to prove it's the same amount.
They're entirely captured by the static, immediate visual state of the objects.
This raises an important question, which Riker addresses by looking at brain development again. Why can't a 5-year-old grasp this? Is it just a lack of education?
If we drilled them on volume and displacement, could we teach them this early?
You might be able to train them to give the correct answer to that specific trick, but they wouldn't truly grasp the underlying logic. And the reason is physical.
The prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain located right behind the forehead, which is responsible for higher order thinking collection, complex logical reasoning, and suppressing impulsive thoughts, is still vastly underdeveloped during these years.
So they literally do not have the neural hardware required to override their visual intuition with abstract logic.
Their reality is based entirely on how things look right now in this exact millisecond.
Exactly. And this underdevelopment in the prefrontal cortex also deeply impacts their memory processing during this stage.
Riker highlights this as the era where we see the transition from basic functional recall to the birth of autobiographical memory.
Autobiographical memory. This is where children begin to construct a narrative of who they are and what they've experienced.
But Riker notes that if you ask a 4-year-old what happened at preschool, the story you get is often a wild, hallucinatory embellishment.
It is a profound blending of reality and imagination. Because they're living in this highly symbolic state, their brains don't strictly compartmentalize episodic memory from imaginative play.
A child might tell you they saw a dinosaur at the park, and in their mind, because they played pretend so vividly, that memory feels just as real as eating lunch.
It has to be maddening for parents trying to get to the bottom of who hit who on the playground.
The child isn't necessarily lying maliciously. Their understanding of objective truth is just extremely fluid.
It is fluid, but it is a necessary cognitive stepping stone. By telling these exaggerated stories, they're practicing the complex task of using symbols to construct sequential narratives.
They're building the scaffolding that will eventually support logical thought.
Which perfectly transitions us into part 3, the concrete operational stage. This spans the ages of 7 to 11.
And here's where we hit a massive, fundamental paradigm shift in the text. Riker titles this section of the book around the idea of a rational awakening.
This stage is where the magical, intuitive, highly subjective thinking of the toddler years begins to evaporate.
It's replaced by a concrete, logical grip on reality. The child's mind becomes highly systematic.
They finally grasp cause and effect in a reliable, predictable way. And one of the primary indicators of this is their mastery of categorization.
Riker gives a great practical example of this. He talks about a kid named Jake sitting on the floor with a massive bin of Lego bricks.
A preoperational child might just build a chaotic tower or sort them into arbitrary piles.
But Jake, who is in the concrete operational stage, will systematically sort the bricks. He separates them by color shade, then by measurement. The 2x4s here, the 1x3s there, the specialized pieces in another pile.
He isn't just playing, he's practicing hierarchical classification. He understands that a red 2x4 block belongs to the category of red blocks, but also simultaneously belongs to the category of rectangular blocks.
This ability to hold multiple properties in mind at once is a huge leap. Riker also discusses seriation here.
Seriation. That's the ability to order items along a logical, quantifiable dimension. Like a little girl named Sarah lining up all her dolls strictly from the shortest to the tallest or arranging sticks by length.
These skills categorization and seriation are not just neat organizational habits. They are the absolute bedrock of mathematical reasoning.
You cannot understand that 5 is greater than 3 and 3 is greater than 1 until you can mentally seriate objects.
And it is because of this newfound logical machinery that children in this stage finally solve the conservation problems that stumped them earlier.
Right, the water glass trick doesn't work on an 8-year-old. They look at you like you're an idiot if you ask which glass has more.
The text uses the famous clay experiment to illustrate this. If you give a concrete operational child 2 identical, perfectly round balls of clay, they agree the amount is the same.
Then you take one ball and violently squish it flat into a pancake shape.
A pre-operational child would say the pancake has more clay because it looks wider.
But the concrete operational child will confidently explain that the amount of clay has not changed. They have developed the crucial cognitive ability of reversibility.
They can mentally play the tape backward. They know that if you roll the pancake back up, it returns to the exact same ball. Actions can be undone.
This realization that physical transformations do not alter the fundamental properties of matter allows them to understand basic mathematics, geometry, and spatial relationships.
Addition and subtraction become logical constants rather than just memorized facts.
Okay, here is where it gets really interesting, and we need to lean into exactly how Riker frames this in the source material because it takes a sharp turn into modern socio-political philosophy.
Riker makes a very specific targeted argument here regarding a concept called decentration.
Let's define the term first. Decentration is the direct opposite of the egocentrism we discussed earlier.
It is the cognitive ability to step outside of your own immediate perspective and actively consider multiple aspects of a situation, including how things look or feel from another person's vantage point.
Now, Riker explicitly connects this cognitive milestone to the development of what he calls the rational man. We have to impartially report what the author asserts here because he is speaking directly to a very specific demographic.
The text states that understanding this stage is essential for red-pilled, rational men navigating today's world.
Yes, the author's framing is quite explicit. Riker argues that this stage of cognitive development holds the vital blueprints for how we maintain an objective grasp on reality as adults.
He asserts that our modern institutions and public discourse have largely regressed into pre-operational egocentrism, driven by emotion, subjective lived experiences, and a refusal to acknowledge objective reality.
The book argues this regression is tied to institutions being captured by feminists and Marxists. Again, we are just breaking down the source material's claims here.
Quoting the source directly, Riker states that appreciating different perspectives, actively holding 2 conflicting viewpoints in your mind to analyze them without emotional bias, is the absolute cornerstone of rationality.
He argues it is essential for navigating the complex social and political landscape of adulthood.
The text literally asks, and isn't that what being red-pilled is all about? Stripping away the comforting illusions and subjective biases to see the stark objective mechanics of reality.
To anchor this philosophical point in psychology, Riker returns to Piaget and uses the famous 3-mountain task. This is a brilliant experiment to illustrate the birth of this rationality.
In this task, a child is brought to a table that has a 3D diorama of 3 distinct mountains.
One mountain has snow, one has a cross, and one has a little house. The child is allowed to walk entirely around the table, taking in the landscape from 360 degrees.
So they have full spatial context.
Yes. Then the child is seated on one side of the table. The researcher takes a small doll and places it in a chair on the exact opposite side of the table.
The researcher then hands the child a stack of photographs showing the mountains from various angles. The child is asked to select the photograph that shows exactly what the doll is currently seeing.
A younger pre-operational child will inevitably pick the photograph that shows their own current view. They cannot decouple their mind from their own eyeballs.
But a child in the concrete operational stage, a child who's developing this rational decentration, will correctly choose the photograph that represents the doll's perspective on the other side of the table.
They can mentally project themselves into another physical and cognitive space.
Riker uses this experiment as a massive metaphor. He argues that shedding egocentrism and objectively assessing reality from multiple, often conflicting vantage points is the defining trait of a mature, sovereign mind.
He asserts that in a culture that increasingly rewards emotional reactivity and tribalism, this specific cognitive skill decentration must be actively, ruthlessly honed into adulthood to maintain an objective grasp on reality.
It's a highly specific application of Piaget's developmental theory to a modern ideological framework.
Regardless of one's personal socio-political leanings, the text firmly anchors the concept of the red-pilled man, which it defines as someone seeking unvarnished objective truth, to Piaget's foundational definition of concrete reasoning.
It's a fascinating lens to put on an 80-year-old psychological theory. Alongside this logical awakening, Riker notes that the concrete operational stage brings massive memory enhancements.
Because the brain is now highly organized, children can begin to use systematic problem solving and mnemonic devices.
Riker specifically highlights the use of the method of loci, commonly known as memory palaces.
I love this concept. Memory palaces are basically cognitive hacks.
They are, and they're only possible because the child has finally mastered spatial relationships and concrete categorization.
The method of loci involves taking information you need to remember, say a list of historical dates or a grocery list, and mentally linking each item to a specific physical location along a familiar walking route, like the rooms in your own house.
You imagine walking through your front door and placing a giant loaf of bread on the entryway table. Then you walk into the kitchen and imagine a carton of eggs smashed on the stove.
Exactly. Because the child's mind is now firmly rooted in concrete reality, they can mentally navigate that physical space at will and retrieve the data they left there.
Riker points out that this represents a huge leap in their executive function. They are no longer just remembering things passively. They are actively controlling, organizing, and utilizing their own cognitive resources.
Okay, that leads us to part 4, the formal operational stage. This begins around age 12 and extends into adulthood.
This is the final software upgrade in Piaget's original model, where the mind achieves true abstract mastery.
In the previous stage, the concrete operational stage, the child's logic was incredibly sharp, but it was fundamentally tethered to physical, tangible objects.
They can do complex math with physical blocks, or understand conservation with actual clay.
But in the formal operational stage, the mind completely breaks free from the physical world. Adolescents develop the capacity for hypothetical, deductive, and highly abstract reasoning.
They no longer need the blocks. They can do the math entirely in the dark void of their own minds. Riker uses a couple of great tests to illustrate this shift. First is the ingenuity test.
Which sounds like a trap.
It does. You give someone a candle, a small cardboard box full of thumbtacks, and a book of matches. The task is to attach the candle to a corkboard on the wall in such a way that when you light it, the wax won't drip onto the table below.
It is a test of functional fixedness. A person stuck in concrete thinking looks at the objects strictly based on their intended physical function.
They might try to melt the bottom of the candle and stick it to the wall, which fails. Or they try to drive a tack directly through the brittle wax of the candle, which shatters it.
But someone who has achieved formal operational thought can look past the obvious physical utility. They can abstractly reimagine the objects.
They realize the box holding the tacks isn't just packaging. It is a tool itself.
They empty the tacks, use one tack to pin the empty box to the corkboard, and then place the candle inside the box. They have created a shelf.
They're thinking outside the box, both literally and cognitively.
The text also details the classic pendulum problem, which tests deductive reasoning.
You show a teenager a pendulum swinging, and you give them strings of different lengths and weights of different sizes.
You ask them what single factor determines how fast the pendulum swings. Is it the length of the string, the heaviness of the weight, the height from which you drop it, or the force of the push you give it?
A younger child, even a smart one in the concrete stage, will just start frantically changing all the variables at once.
They'll put a heavy weight on a short string and push it hard, then a light weight on a long string and drop it softly. They get a jumble of conflicting data and end up completely confused.
But an adolescent with formal operational reasoning approaches it like a seasoned scientist. They understand the abstract concept of isolating variables.
They will systematically test one thing at a time. They will keep the weight, the drop height, and the push exactly the same and only change the length of the string.
Then they will hold the string constant and only change the weight.
Through methodical deduction, they isolate the truth. The length of the string is the sole determining factor of the pendulum's speed.
So what does this massive leap in abstract processing mean for the teenager on a personal, emotional level? Because teenagers aren't exactly known for being cold, calculating scientists.
They are usually an emotional mess.
Right. Riker dives deep into how this abstract thought is actually the catalyst for teenagers forming their deep personal identities.
The emotional turbulence of adolescence is directly tied to this cognitive upgrade, because they can now ponder endless what ifs and imagine theoretical futures that don't yet exist. They can turn their analytical gaze inward.
They can deeply contemplate potential career paths, debate complex political ideologies, and construct their own moral and personal values.
They can ask profound existential questions about their own identity. Who am I if I am not just my parents' child?
They can finally perceive themselves as an abstract concept in the minds of others, which leads to that intense teenage self-consciousness. Riker introduces a vital concept here called meta-memory.
Meta-memory is a higher-order executive function. It is the ability to monitor, evaluate, and actively control one's own memory and thought processes.
You aren't just thinking, you are acting as an internal auditor observing how you think.
An adult uses this constantly. You might realize I am terrible at remembering names at networking events, so I need to instantly write them down on my phone.
Or I know I procrastinate on big projects, so I need to break this down into smaller, artificially deadline tasks.
Exactly. Riker argues that mastering meta-memory is the critical meta-skill for maximizing human potential efficiency and rationality in adulthood. It is the ultimate tool for self-optimization.
Which acts as the perfect bridge into part 5 of our deep dive, The Architecture of Morality.
We've mapped the logic circuits, but how do these cognitive software upgrades dictate our sense of right and wrong?
The source explains that Piaget firmly believed morality isn't just culturally indoctrinated, it actually evolves mechanically alongside our cognitive abilities in 2 distinct stages.
It is a fascinating perspective. Piaget argued that you cannot process complex moral nuance if you lack the cognitive hardware to process abstract thought.
The first stage he identified is the heteronymous stage of morality, which dominates early childhood.
In this stage, children view rules as absolute, fixed, and handed down by an infallible higher authority, whether that is a parent, a teacher, or God.
Rules are basically laws of physics to them. And the wildest part of this stage is that the concept of intent completely does not matter to the child.
Riker uses a classic Piagetian dilemma to prove this. Imagine you tell a child a story about 2 different boys. The first boy is trying to be helpful.
He's carrying a tray to help his mother set the dinner table. He trips on a rug, drops the tray, and accidentally shatters 15 expensive teacups.
Then you tell them about the second boy. This boy is angry because his mother wouldn't give him a cookie. In a fit of rage, he grabs 1 teacup off the counter and intentionally smashes it on the floor.
You then ask a child in the heteronymous stage, which boy was naughtier? Which boy deserves a worse punishment?
Almost universally, a young child will say, the first boy, the one who is trying to help, is far naughtier. Why? Because they are entirely focused on the objective physical outcome.
The first boy caused a massive amount of visible damage, 15 broken cups. The second boy only broke 1.
Their cognitive abilities are still tied to concrete visible results. They cannot yet process the abstract, invisible concept of internal intention.
It is a completely ruthless, outcome-based morality. But then, as their brains mature and they enter the formal operational stage, they shift into the autonomous stage of morality.
In the autonomous stage, the individual achieves a massive philosophical realization. Rules are not handed down by the universe. Rules are social contracts.
They are created by people to maintain order, and therefore they can be negotiated, bent, or changed by mutual agreement.
And crucially, intent replaces outcome as the primary factor in moral judgment.
The text gives the classic example of a story about a starving boy stealing apples from a market.
A young heteronymous child will say the boy is entirely wicked, case closed, because stealing breaks a rule.
But an older child operating with autonomous morality will weigh the boy's abstract hunger and his biological intention to survive against the rigid rule of property rights.
They will judge the act as vastly less severe or perhaps entirely justified.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Riker explains how Piaget's foundational ideas on the mechanics of morality were expanded upon by later heavyweights in psychology.
The text specifically highlights the tension between the theories of Lawrence Kohlberg and Carol Gilligan.
Kohlberg took Piaget's foundation and built a massive 6-stage model of moral development. Kohlberg's model was heavily, almost exclusively justice-oriented.
He tracked how human beings move from simply avoiding punishment in early childhood to obeying laws to maintain social order, to eventually, ideally operating on universal abstract moral principles of absolute justice and human rights.
Kohlberg's framework is highly analytical and logical, but Riker notes a massive controversy here. Kohlberg based his extensive research almost entirely on male subjects.
This led another prominent psychologist, Carol Gilligan, to heavily critique his work. Gilligan proposed an alternative care-focused framework.
She argued that moral development, particularly in women, is often oriented around preserving relationships, minimizing harm, empathy, and an ethic of care, rather than strictly adhering to cold, abstract concepts of blind justice.
And Riker synthesizes this incredibly well. He points out how these varying moral frameworks, the justice orientation versus the care orientation, which are built on top of Piaget's cognitive stages, profoundly shape all of our adult social interactions.
Our legal systems and our modern political tribalism today, you can map entire political platforms based on whether they prioritize abstract justice and rules or empathetic care in relationships.
It is a brilliant sociological observation. However, as robust and influential as Piaget's theory is, the scientific method demands skepticism.
Which brings us to my favorite part of any deep dive. Part 6, blind spots, criticisms, and the real world. I love it when we pivot to the contrarian views. Where did Piaget fall short? Where was he wrong?
The source brings up a brilliant Russian psychologist named Lev Vygotsky, who severely challenged Piaget's core idea that kids just naturally level up through these stages in isolated individual readiness.
Vygotsky proposed the sociocultural theory of cognitive development. He argued that Piaget operated in a vacuum and severely underestimated the massive role of cultural language and social interaction.
Vygotsky believed that learning isn't just an isolated child interacting with physical objects, it is fundamentally a collaborative social act. He introduced a vital concept called the zone of proximal development, or the ZPD.
Break down the ZPD for us.
Imagine a circle. Inside the circle is everything a child can learn and do completely independently. Outside the circle is everything that is currently impossible for them to grasp no matter what.
The zone of proximal development is the ring just outside their current capability.
It represents the skills and concepts a child can master only with the active guidance, scaffolding, and interaction of a more knowledgeable mentor, whether that is a parent, a teacher, or an older sibling.
Vygotsky argued that actual cognitive growth happens almost entirely in this socially mediated zone, completely contradicting Piaget's model of the solitary scientist.
Riker also brings in Albert Bandura and his famous theory of observational learning.
Piaget focused entirely on direct physical trial and error interaction. You have to drop the block to know how it falls.
But Bandura proved that kids absorb massive, complex amounts of information simply by watching others.
A toddler doesn't have to touch a hot stove if they watch their older sibling touch it and scream. They learn the physics and the consequence entirely through observation.
This massively accelerates the learning curve beyond what Piaget's rigid stages allow for.
And then there is what Rico calls the emotion gap. I think this is the most devastating critique of Piaget.
Piaget's stages map out this beautiful architecture of cold, calculating, pristine logic. But they almost entirely ignore the messy, chaotic, massive role that human emotions play in cognitive processing and decision-making.
Piaget treated the brain like a pure calculating engine. But Riker brings up one of the most famous medical cases in history to illustrate why this is a flaw, the story of Phineas Gage.
Gage was a railroad construction foreman in the 1840s. While packing explosive powder into a rock with a heavy iron tamping rod, the powder prematurely detonated.
The explosion drove the 3-foot-long, inch-thick iron rod straight up under his left cheekbone, completely to his frontal lobe and out the top of his skull.
It is a miracle he didn't die instantly.
Miraculously, Gage survived. He was awake and talking minutes later. And to the astonishment of doctors, his intellectual abilities, his raw logic, his memory, and his speech were largely intact.
By Piagetian standards, his cognitive software was functioning perfectly. However, the physical damage severed the crucial neural connections between the emotional centers of his brain, the limbic system, and his prefrontal reasoning centers.
And what happened to him?
The results were catastrophic for his life. Because his reasoning was completely divorced from his emotions, his ability to make decisions was utterly destroyed. He couldn't prioritize.
He became impulsive, profane, and entirely unreliable. He made terrible financial and social choices.
His personality drastically changed to the point where friends said he was no longer Gage. This case profoundly proves that you cannot separate emotion from logic.
True human rationality requires the integration of emotional effect. Logic alone cannot drive human behavior.
The source backs this up with a more modern story about a boy named Peter.
Peter was intellectually brilliant, off the charts in math and logic. He was firmly in the formal operational stage.
But he failed completely in social settings and suffered immense anxiety because he lacked the emotional comprehension to read social cues.
He had the logic, but lacked the effective integration, proving that cognitive development models are incomplete if they ignore the emotional engine.
But despite these very valid criticisms, Riker spends a significant portion of the book synthesizing how we absolutely must apply Piaget's foundational knowledge to the real world today, particularly in the realms of education, parenting, and understanding learning disabilities.
Let's talk about parenting first, because this is intensely practical. Riker points out that truly understanding these rigid developmental stages can save parents years of anger and frustration.
If you know that your 4-year-old is deep in the preoperational stage, they are biologically, physically egocentric and entirely lack abstract thought.
Therefore, you shouldn't scream at them for failing to grasp the abstract moral concept of sharing their favorite toy.
You are demanding that they process a moral abstraction that requires decentration, seeing the sorrow of the other child, which their prefrontal cortex literally cannot compute yet.
You are screaming at a computer for failing to run a software program it hasn't installed yet. It's an exercise in futility.
Exactly. And moving to education, Riker brilliantly frames learning disabilities not as a generalized lack of intelligence, but as highly specific roadblocks within these Piagetian stages.
This is a paradigm-shifting way to view special education. Take dysgraphia, which is a severe struggle with the physical act of writing.
Riker frames this not as a linguistic failure, but as a hurdle rooted all the way back in the sensorimotor stage. The brain is struggling to properly coordinate fine motor skills and spatial relationships on the paper.
Or consider dyslexia. A child might have flawlessly mastered the concrete physical world that can build complex engines or navigate forests, but they hit a massive roadblock when trying to transition into the preoperational symbolic realm.
They struggle to decode the abstract visual symbols of letters and map them to auditory words.
And dyscalculia is perfectly understood as a roadblock in the concrete operational stage.
The child's brain struggles to grasp the logic of seriation, categorization, and conservation of numbers.
Understanding these disabilities through the mechanical lens of Piaget allows educators to stop using brute force memorization and instead tailor their interventions to clear the specific cognitive block the child is facing.
Okay, we're rounding the final corner into part 7, the future of cognitive psychology.
We've mapped out Piaget's 4 stages, ending with formal operational abstract thought in adolescence.
But Riker reveals that our cognitive development does not actually just stop when we hit puberty. There is a whole modern school of researchers called the Neo-Piagetians who are redrawing the map.
The Neo-Piagetians argue that the human mind undergoes further refinement, advocating for a post-formal stage of cognitive development that extends deep into adulthood.
Piaget believed formal operational thought, cold, absolute deductive logic, was the peak of human cognition. But the text quotes developmental psychologists like Dr. Marilyn Wilson, who state that this isn't enough for the real world.
Because life isn't a physics equation. Adolescents in the formal stage often think in incredibly rigid absolutes. To a teenager, an ideology is either 100% flawless or 100% evil. A person is either a hero or a villain.
Exactly. Post-formal thinking is the cognitive upgrade that allows adults to process profound ambiguity.
It is the ability to handle contradictions, navigate moral paradoxes, and understand complex metaphors.
A post-formal thinker realizes that multiple conflicting truths can exist simultaneously in the messy gray areas of the real world, and they can make pragmatic decisions despite that uncertainty.
Riker also dedicates a massive section of this final chapter to the ongoing urgent debates pushing Piaget's theories into the 21st century. And the biggest elephant in the room is technology.
How does screen time affect this intricate progression of stages?
It is the defining developmental debate of our era.
If Piaget proved incontrovertibly that infants absolutely require physical touch, physical motor skills, and 3-dimensional sensory interaction to build their baseline cognitive software, laying down those quadrillion fiber optic cables, what happens when you replace wooden blocks, dirt, and physical gravity with a flat, smooth 2D iPad screen?
Is the screen time acting as a hypercatalyst that accelerates symbolic learning? Or is it a barrier that is fundamentally stunting their sensorimotor development because they aren't interacting with physical mass and consequence?
The data is deeply concerning. The text also raises questions about the universality of Piaget's stages across different global cultures.
Piaget studied Western industrialized children in Geneva. What about indigenous cultures that prioritize communal group survival learning over isolated individual exploration.
Do those children reach these cognitive milestones in a different sequence or utilize different logical frameworks altogether?
So, wrapping all of this massive theory together, what does this all mean for us, the adults listening to this?
It means that while Jean Piaget gave us the foundational architectural blueprint of the human mind, the territory is vast and still being actively explored.
Understanding this cognitive architecture isn't just academic trivia. It allows us to optimize our own adult logic, refine our meta-memory strategies to be more efficient, and perhaps most importantly, as Riker argues, maintain a rational, objective grip on reality in an increasingly subjective world.
But it also requires us to constantly adapt this aging framework to a rapidly, violently changing modern technological environment.
Which leads perfectly to our final provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your week.
If Piaget proved that our mental software, the very way we process reality, is written entirely by our physical friction with the world, by touching, dropping, failing, and testing physical reality, what happens to the cognitive development of the next generation when their primary environment becomes entirely virtual?
If a child spends their critical developmental years plugged into virtual reality, interacting with digital objects that have no physical weight, no real-world physics, and no physical consequence, are we evolving an entirely new transcendent stage of human cognition?
Or are we fundamentally, irreversibly stunting the most critical operating system we possess? Think about that the next time you hand a toddler a smartphone.
It is a profound, slightly terrifying question, and one that the next generation of developmental psychologists will be wrestling with for decades to come.
Absolutely.
And that wraps up our massive deep dive into the architecture of the human mind. We'll remind you one last time, hit that like button, subscribe to the show, and leave us a comment with your thoughts on that final question.
And seriously, if you want to truly master your understanding of human development psychology and rationality, you need to buy Conrad Reicher's ebook right now.
Go to Amazon Kindle or Google Playbooks and search for Piaget's Stages, a simplified guide to understanding human development. It will completely change how you view yourself, the adults you work with, and the children you raise.
Also, stay sharp, stay objective, and make sure to follow the author at Conrad's Reicher on Substack for more incredible rational insights into the human condition.
Thank you so much for joining us, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.